I do thank you all for inviting me to be part of your day and to be one of the participants in your discussion today. I know that this is an auspicious day for a lot of people with the throne speech coming down today. And, you know, I had to think about whether to give up this presentation and watch the throne speech. And that was about a 0.25 second thought, as there's no question that the throne speeches are important, but at the same time, they're deadly dull to listen to, and you can always pick up the best information from reading about them shortly after. And I already have staff who are giving me a briefing document, and they're preparing it right now as we speak. So I expect that I'll get something emailed to me very shortly. So I'll know about that very quickly. And today as well is a special day for me because I'm also receiving the Adrian Clarkson Prize for Global Citizenship, which is also being broadcast in about an hour, I think. And so with any luck, I'll be able to catch that video. We've already pre-recorded all of that, so I don't have to actually be on camera, but my law firm here has decided that everybody will get the free time at lunch and gather in the boardroom and at their desks, and that lunch will be provided so that they can all watch it. I think maybe they're under orders to watch it. I'm not sure, but I'm told that that's also going to be well attended, and I'm looking forward to getting a chance to see the video of that. But this day that you're having is going to be an auspicious day for you because you have lots of opportunities to move forward now, looking at the issue of child and family services in the context of not only the outcome of the TRC report and the other studies that have now accumulated over the relatively short period of time since the TRC report was filed. But you also now have to consider what is going to happen with regard to family services in the context of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in British Columbia. Well, you also have an election going on in BC, don't you? And also Bill C-92, which is the federal Indian child welfare legislation or Indigenous child welfare legislation, which I think is going to be beginning of a remarkable change in the way that we do child and family services at the community level. Authority is being recognized for Indigenous communities to enact their own laws relating to child welfare, and what those laws are going to look like is an area that I think is going to be interesting to watch as we go forward. I hope that the group that I'm involved with here will have an opportunity to have some input into that. But at the same time, I think across the country, the nature of legislation relating to Indigenous children is going to be an area of growth, but it's also going to be challenged by the fact that the issue of funding is still relatively unresolved, and the issue of the nature of the federal and provincial commitment to support initiatives that the communities might want to take is also going to be an area that I think is probably not going to go smoothly. Eventually it will be, but I think initially there's going to be a number of hurdles that we need to keep an eye on. But let me begin by just making an observation that I think is worthwhile for us to keep in mind as we go forward, and that is that I always think it's important for us to understand why things are the way they are. And so you just had a presentation in which if I understood the portions that I was able to listen to well and to put it into some kind of context, I suspect that you now are beginning to look at the nature of the implications and um, the impact that child welfare proceedings are having in Indigenous communities and among Indigenous families and for Indigenous children, and what the long-term impact that is, and uh, and also recognizing that the statistics for the number of Indigenous children in care is increasing quite dramatically. Let me talk a bit about why that's the case, but I want to talk initially about where this all came from and how this all started. You will probably know some of this history that I'm going to relate to you. You'll know, of course, those elements of the history more recently that have had a direct impact on your lives, and probably much of what you heard during the work of the TRC is going to be something that you're aware of. But I want to talk a bit about things that occurred before then. One of the things that we came to recognize very early on in my work, starting with the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, but even before that, in discussions I had with various academics and scholars and elders over my years of development as a lawyer, was that we have a long history of taking care of our own, of having laws that govern the way that we did things, of being able to regulate our own activities and do it in a very fair and even-handed way, and do it in a way that made sense to our people. So among my tribe, the Ojibways, or Anishinaabes, as we call ourselves, the governance system was founded upon the concept of 7 clans, and each of the clans had a significant and special responsibility to contribute to the governance of the tribe and the community. And while the tribe often would break up into various smaller factions of bands that would be located in various parts of the territory, they would always come together on regular bases, usually 4 times a year at each season, in order to celebrate the season, in order to celebrate other things, but also to discuss the nature of relationships, both internal, the nature of the laws that were in place and whether some laws needed to be modified or simply reinforced, and that people had an opportunity to be told what those laws were and be made to understand the importance of that, and also the opportunity to engage in significant tribal activities, not just ceremonial activities, those were important, but tribal activities such as dialogue around relationships with adjacent tribes or nearby tribes or incoming settlements and things such as that. And the other bit of information that most people tend to forget is that we have been doing that for thousands and thousands of years, taking care of our own affairs. Anthropologists are pretty racist, quite frankly, historically racist in their perception of Indigenous people. They tended to poo-poo what Indigenous people did and how they functioned and what they contributed to mainstream society. And it's partially because they've studied it very rarely. There's a well-known phrase from Louis Leakey, who is quoted at a conference as having said that one of the most misunderstood and least studied areas of the world when it came to anthropological and archaeological work was North America. And he encouraged archaeologists and anthropologists to study the peoples of North America and the communities of North America in order to come to a better understanding. Much of what anthropologists did and espoused was a direct reflection of the political and religious language of the time. So the Bering Strait theory is probably a good example of that, because while just about every tribe that I have ever visited and spoken to have a creation story which talks about their being created in this territory, in this land, in this space where they are now, almost all anthropologists supported the theory that Indigenous people came here over the Bering Strait. And that was taught as fact, even though it was only ever a theory, and that's why it's called the Bering Strait theory. It was only ever a theory, and yet they taught it as fact in schools and universities and in public dialogue. They never suggested that it wasn't a fact. And then they argued a bit about how long ago that occurred. And initially they estimated that it was probably 5,000 years ago. And then with more conversation and some more archaeological site findings that changed their thinking, they finally came up with a view that Indigenous people came over the Bering Strait about 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. But until then, they came from Asia, that there were no people in this area. It was uninhabited, and that they weren't here all that much longer than the Europeans were. And that was taught to many people, particularly Indigenous people, who, of course, always saw it as a challenge to their creation stories. Our creation story says that we are created here, that we were created here at the time of creation, and that we were part of this land, and that we were part of the creation of this place. And from a scientific perspective, I've had conversations with scientists about the creation story of the people, and asked, is it possible? The one question that I've raised is it possible that with continental drift, that Indigenous people have in fact always been on this land, but it's the land that has moved apart from the other continents through continental drift? And I have to tell you that most scientists kind of scratch their head and say, I don't know, I don't think so, because that's their bias. But at the same time, I have always thought it is a plausible thought and something that's worth pursuing. But it would certainly reinforce the creation stories of all the people in North America that I've ever heard. But really, that it was important for me to tell you that, only for you to know that according to our teachings, we have been here since the very beginning of time. And in fact, one elder who I regularly visit with, he always talks about in the beginning, before the beginning. It kind of expects me to figure that out, but in the beginning, before the beginning, to me, tells me that it's back at the time of the creation of this world, and that we were put here, and that we have been here that long. And how long have we been here? Well, certainly a lot longer than 15,000 years. Some estimates are now that it might be as long as 100,000 years ago, or even longer than that. But they're relying again on archaeological sites and archaeological digs in order to come up with those numbers. And they're not listening to the stories of the people. The stories of the people are that we have always been here. So when we have been here that long, when we have governed ourselves that long, we had to develop sophisticated ways of doing things. We had to develop laws. We had to develop ways of taking care of each other, ways of supporting each other. And of course, one of those areas always was and always had to be taking care of children where parents were unable to, sometimes because parents died or were lost in some other way, or sometimes because children would be kidnapped and brought back after a period of time. and the parents themselves might have been murdered, or sometimes it's just that parents were not able to take care of as many children as they were having, and so taking care of children within the tribe was an important part of seeing the future of the people. And it was always one that was taken care of. And in my tribe, again, going back to what my teachings were, we were always taught that it was the women who made those decisions about what was to be done with children. I was born in 1951. I just want to give you an example of how I think that worked. I was born in 1951. My father and mother got married in the year after the Second World War ended. They had 5 children. They lost a daughter in birth, but there were 4 of us who survived. I was the second youngest. And my mother was in frail health because she had suffered from tuberculosis. And she had, in fact, been sent from her community into a sanatorium in order to be treated for tuberculosis. While she was in the sanatorium, of course, it was so far away from her community that none of her family ever came to visit her. And it happened that one of my aunts worked in the sanatorium as a nurse's aide, or the equivalent of what we would call a nurse's aide today. She helped clean up the patients and clean up the rooms and help feed the patients who were older or not able to take care of themselves. Anyway, she met this young woman, my mother, who was there as a young woman, older teenager, and saw how lonely she was and how alone she was. And she used to visit her. We didn't live far away from the sanatorium. And so she arranged to bring her to our place on weekends or for holidays in order to visit, have a place to live in a house. And that's how she and my father met. When my father came back from the war during one of his furloughs, they met, they fell in love, and they talked about getting married, I'm told. And so he went off to war, and in the war he was badly injured. He was not able to come home right away. He was in hospital in England for almost a year. They thought he was going to die. He was basically in a foxhole that was hit by a bomb, and so he wasn't expected to live. But when they finished treating him, they found that he could walk, and they sent him home. And he came home after the war, in fact, had ended. And the people who were witness to the event talk about the fact that when he got off the train at the station, that my mother was there and my grandmother was there. My dad's mother was there as well. And that while my mother and my father both wanted to embrace each other first, my mother insisted and stepped aside so that my grandmother could be the first one to touch him when he got off the train. So that's how the respect for women was reflected. And then shortly after that, they got married. And in 1952, the year after I was born, my mother passed away. She had tuberculosis. She was in a weakened state anyway, but she also suffered a stroke giving birth to my brother. And about 13 weeks after he was born, she died. And my father was left to take care of all of us, 4 of us. And he was unable to. He was just too traumatized by the war experience yet. Plus, of course, he lost the woman that he loved and couldn't manage it. So he arranged for us to go to my grandmother's house, and asked her to take care of us. And then essentially he disappeared after that. We didn't see him for many, many years. He lived a very hard life. He lived on the streets for most of it, became an alcoholic. And And the only reason I think that he ever lived to be an old man was that the other veterans of the war who lived on the street with him took care of him. Tommy Prince was one of them, and they were close friends. But living with my grandmother, there was no child welfare system in place at the time. There was no child welfare agency that we could rely upon, or that would have intervened or could have intervened in our lives. And because my grandmother was there to take care of us, the government officials who were monitoring the situation didn't really have any concern, because it was not uncommon for this to occur. But my grandmother was 63. My grandfather was 68 at the time that we went to live with them. And they were quite elderly. I'm now almost 70, and I can't imagine what it would be like to have young children coming into the house to be raised by us. I have a hard time with 2 little puppies that we got this year, taking care of them. I can't imagine what it'd be like to have a handful of little kids running around the place. So my grandmother created a child welfare system in the house. My grandmother had 13 children altogether, 5 boys and 8 girls. And of the 8 girls, by the time my brother was born, at the time my mother died, 5 of those young women were still living at home. One of them was still a pre-teenage, about 12 years old. And the others, though, were in their teens. And of course, my aunt, who worked at the sanatorium, was also living at home at the time. And so what she did was she assigned one of the aunties to take care of one of us. So I happened to be assigned to my aunt, Josephine, who had ambitions to become a teacher, and she did eventually become a teacher. But her responsibility was to take care of me. Her responsibility was to make sure that I got up in the morning, that I washed, that I had breakfast, that I did my homework at night, that I was able to get to school in the morning. Sometimes we had to walk. Occasionally there would be public transportation. A bus would come by. We lived in the country on the old reserve. But sometimes the old bus wouldn't make it, so we'd have to walk to school, which was about 2 miles away. So her responsibility was to make sure that I did that and got there. And she, in effect, raised me from the time that I was a year and a half old until she got married when I was probably 16 years old. And during that time, she became a teacher. And wherever she traveled to teach, and she traveled to many communities to teach in many northern communities, I would travel with her, and I would live with her, and I would take care of the household chores, much like a son would do for a mother. I would chop the wood, I would carry the water, I would help with the yard work and all of that. Plus, you know, she wasn't living alone in the teacherage. It was known that she had a young boy, a young man living with her, and so I guess in a way I was sort of a security as well for her. But she always treated me like a son, and she always encouraged me to have respect for education and learning. And I tell the story that when I was 12 years old, and 12 years was a big birthday year in our family. So when I was 12 years old, I thought I was just going to get a bicycle. I was really convinced that somebody was buying me a bicycle, whether it was my grandparents or my aunts. But I saw this big package sitting in the living room when I came home from school that day. And I thought it was kind of small for a bicycle, but I thought maybe it was all in pieces and I had to put it together. So after dinner, when they had the cake, I opened it up and My aunt had bought me a complete set of encyclopedia and said that that was my 12th birthday gift. And she said that I now had to read the encyclopedia from front to back, and one book a month. And then she was going to test me on what was in that book, which she did. And that's how I learned to love to read. I learned to love learning about other parts of the world, about other aspects of the world, about the world around us. and so my love of learning was a reflection of that gift that she gave me. And the child welfare system that my grandmother created was a very successful system for us. My brothers and my sister all grew up to be responsible adults, except for my older brother. He joined the Navy and he was killed in the Navy. But my sister is still alive, and she has grandchildren, great-grandchildren, as a matter of fact. And my younger brother, he passed away a couple of years ago from a stroke. So he was a confirmed bachelor. He never got married from the time that he was, from the time that he became an adult. He never got married. We don't think he even had a girlfriend. We're pretty sure he didn't have a boyfriend either. He just was a confirmed bachelor, and that's the way he lived. The kids used to love going to visit him because he had a big screen TV in his apartment, and he let them watch whatever shows they wanted. But when football and baseball and hockey were on, that was his time in the TV, and they got to learn those sports during their visits with him. But the child welfare system that my grandmother created really worked to our advantage. Child welfare agencies became part of the system of governance, more established in the 1950s after the Second World War than before. Before, there were occasional church-based agencies that took children in for care, and privately run, but there were no government-run agencies per se until the 1950s, when things started to change. When you look at the statistics today and you see the large number of Indigenous children who are in care, it's always easy to ask yourself, well, where did that all come from? And to conclude, well, there's something wrong with Indigenous people that is causing this to happen, and that we have to keep an eye on them because we can't trust Indigenous people to properly parent children. Look at the high numbers of apprehensions that are going on. I've always maintained that just like the justice system, the child welfare system is a self-fulfilling prophecy, that the more agencies and the more social workers you have, the more kids you're going to put into care. It's like if you hire more cops, you're going to arrest more people. It's just a given. And it's because of the way that we police, and it's because of the way that child welfare agencies have grown up and evolved in the way they do things. And it's also, I think, a reflection of the business models that child welfare agencies use, where those agencies are funded primarily on the basis of taking kids into care, whether voluntarily with the assistance of parents or involuntarily against the parents' wishes, or even to that extent against the family's wishes. But the fact of the matter is that with the growth of child welfare agencies over the years since the 1950s, and if you look at the research, it'll tell you the number of agencies that we now have compared to the number of agencies we've had in the past. You will see a direct reflection of that. And when I was the co-commissioner of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry here in Manitoba, we had a number of things to say about the need for family services to be provided for Indigenous people at the community level. Because we pointed out that the long-term impact of residential schools and colonialism was that Indigenous people were living in a state of imposed poverty, of deprived economic circumstances, and that their circumstances, their situation was not their fault, and that many of the people who had gone to residential school came back traumatized and came back having lived in institutions that didn't give them the ability to parent, didn't teach them how to be parents. And so as a result, Indigenous parents, after residential school experience, often were unable to properly parent. And though they were living in communities where they could rely upon elders and grandmothers and older aunties and sometimes siblings to help them take care of their children. The more generations that passed through residential school and returned home to the communities, the greater the impact of the residential school experience had. And we have to remember that residential schools were with us for a period of about 130 years. And the result was that 7 generations of children went through those schools. And with each generation, they moved further and further away from their understanding of their laws, their traditions, their culture, their language, understanding of their healing methods, understanding of their psychological support systems, and the ability for the elders of the community to help the younger people of the community became more and more reduced because the elders sometimes themselves had come through the residential schools and didn't know their own culture, didn't know their own teachings, didn't know their own history, and therefore were unable to be of much assistance to those who were asking them for help. So the end result at the end of the day was that we see a large number, we still see a growing number of Indigenous children being taken into the child welfare system. And one of the unfortunate aspects of that, and one of the unintended consequences of the AGA report, was that we recommended that Indigenous agencies be created and mandated in order to service Indigenous people in their own communities in accordance with their own customs and belief systems. And for a time, that's how things were done. Indigenous communities and Indigenous agencies were created that were given leeway to be able to do things in accordance with their ways of doing things. So, for example, I know of an agency that before they apprehended a child, they had to consult a circle of elders from the community in order to get a formal support agreement from the elders that the children needed to be taken into care, but at the same time, the elders would give direction as to what that care would look like. So they would often say, now you have to provide treatment for the mothers and or the father. You have to make sure that they go and live with granny, they go and live with an elderly aunt or an elder sibling. So their focus always was on keeping the family together, keeping the community together. And that was the way things started out initially. And they relied upon a provincial mandate. So provincially, under the Constitution, provincially child welfare is their jurisdiction. So feds do have jurisdiction over child welfare with regard to Indigenous people, just like they had jurisdiction over residential schools. But they refused to exercise that jurisdiction until relatively recently. And as a result, Indigenous agencies had to rely upon and had to work with provinces in order to figure out how to do that work. And provinces generally, as I said, initially took a hands-off approach to them and let them do whatever they wanted to, essentially, as long as it was in compliance with the legislation in their own communities. It got a little trickier when Indigenous children were off reserve, our families were off reserve, and they wanted the home agency to be involved. So MOUs and agreements were worked out with regard to how that was to be done. But then things started to change, and I don't know that there's any one singular point where things took a drastic turn, but eventually it got to the point where provinces started to exercise more and more jurisdiction, more and more direction with regard to Indigenous agencies. So in Manitoba, and I'll speak for the Manitoba experience, and it may or may not be the case elsewhere as well. I think it's generally true in the prairie provinces, and it's generally true in Northwest Ontario. The provinces essentially say to Indigenous agencies, if you want to be funded by us for taking care of children, then you have to do it in accordance with these directions. And the other unfortunate thing was that social workers were never trained about this history, were never trained to appreciate what it was that they were walking into. So just like teachers, for example, still are not being educated at faculties of education about the way the public schools have evolved and what public schools are teaching and the curriculums that are being used. When teachers get out in the field, in order to change the way they do things as teachers, they have to essentially develop their own curriculum. Social workers are much in the same way, having initially had to figure out how to do things that made more sense to them, culturally speaking. And that was part of the challenge for the provinces, because the provinces, in fact, started to feel that that was not acceptable. And so they started to impose sanctions on child welfare agencies, limitations on their mandate, requirements that they report to provincial officials, and that they had to have social workers who were making decisions with regard to children who were provincially trained or trained at the university level and had received that biased education experience, and who believed that the child welfare legislation of the province was superior legislation and had to be followed to the letter. We had an unfortunate case in Manitoba called the Murray Sinclair Inquiry, involving a situation where a child was killed. An Indigenous child was killed by her mother and her mother's partner. And the Indigenous agencies that were involved in, and even some of the non-Indigenous agencies, were criticized in a subsequent inquiry for not having made enough of an effort to intervene on behalf of the child. And so that added impetus to the work of agencies to be more involved with children. Since that inquiry, one of the sad consequences has been that we have, on average, a birth apprehension rate of about one child per day. So every day, one child is apprehended from a hospital here in Manitoba by a child welfare agency, not because the mother has done anything to the child. Obviously, she just gave birth to the child. Not even necessarily because the mother has a history of child abuse or a history of not being able to care for children, but because in some cases they say the mother herself was a child welfare ward, and therefore she's not capable of being a mother, regardless of the fact that such young mothers often have family supports that they can call upon in order to help them with the child that they're having. Some of them are teenage mothers and need that support. But the consequence is that in Manitoba, we have more and more children being apprehended at birth now than we've ever had in the past. We have more children that are in care now in Manitoba and probably throughout Canada of child welfare agencies than we ever had in the care of the residential school system. And that's crazy when you think about the fact that we have made a commitment to try to change the way that we're doing business, to try to change the way that we're doing things. And those agencies that have succeeded, and there are some that have succeeded in avoiding those pitfalls, have done so while still being challenged by provincial officials, while still being challenged, sometimes even by the federal government. We've had instances where the federal government has withheld funding from Indigenous agencies or has funded Indigenous agencies at a much lower rate than they fund the provincial agencies for taking care of the same child, because they say that Indigenous agencies are not as professional as non-Indigenous agencies are. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. There's a lot of change that needs to take place. And it all begins with the way that we educate social workers. It begins with the way that we structure the work that we do. It begins by changing a business model that we use. Change as well is required in the way that we make decisions and how we engage with the community in decision making. I know of very few agencies now that engage with elders in terms of making decisions around child welfare. And while almost all agencies and provincial governments say they are committed to keeping families together, the reality is that almost always the first placement that a child faces when taken away from their mother is to be placed outside of the family. And that creates a lot of problems for the child. It gets rather into a weird situation where sometimes they say we can't return the child right away to the mother, even when the court says the child is not in need of protection and must be returned. I've heard agencies argue, well, we'll have to return the child gradually because to move the child from a foster parent back to the mother is going to be traumatic to the child. And yet they never think about the trauma that they are inflicting on the child when they apprehend the child, that there should be a better way of doing it than what is now the case. And we need to just be cognizant of that. So I've wandered around this territory too long and in this subject area. I know that we had decided that we'd leave some time for questions and answers. Unfortunately, I can't see any of the questions because I turned off the chat function to keep from being distracted. So I'll leave it to the moderator to send the questions to me. But I'm glad to have been part of this discussion, this dialogue with you. And I look forward to the opportunity to deal with some of the questions and answers now. And take your questions as the moderator sees fit. And thank you once again for allowing me to be part of this day. I want to acknowledge that if I had been there, I would have acknowledged the territory in which I was present, but it's only my image that's in your territory. I don't know what the image acknowledgement ceremony is or statement is, but I acknowledge the fact that my image is in your territory, so we'll take it from there. So thank you very much.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is my mic on? Oh, can you, oh, there you are. Thank you, Senator Masai. Really appreciate it. This is Robert, by the way. I have Executive Director Marlena Mann, who has been taking questions down on our live stream, and of course she'll be taking questions from those here as well. So Marlena will take it from here.
Sounds good. Thanks, Robert, and thank you, Senator. I have a question from Terry Lugi-Sabo. She asks, what are your thoughts on the Black Lives Matter movement and reconciliation as it relates to Indigenous people in Canada?
Well, okay. It doesn't matter what presentation I've done in the last 5 months. Everybody wants to talk about that. So a couple of things. First of all, the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada, at least, certainly includes the Indigenous community as part of the dialogue, and I don't think we should forget that. Many of those who participate in the Black Lives Matter events are, in fact, from the Indigenous community. And I think as well that that's not necessarily just a show of our support for Black people. I think it's also a reflection of the fact that we have a shared experience when it comes to the justice system and policing in particular. In the AGA report, we talked about the issue of bias in policing, and that one of the impacts of past police recruiting techniques was that people were being hired who were not well suited to the policing function, which we felt at that time. This is almost 30 years ago now. We felt at that time the policing function was about learning how to deal with people without hurting them. We pointed out in the AGI report that police officers often said, well, this is a violent person and he's acting unstably and we have no choice but to kind of get physical and get him under control. And my response, I remember at one session was, I know dozens and dozens of nurses who will tell you that they work in hospitals with violent people who are unstable, who are acting out, and they manage to get their work done and deal with those people without killing them. So why can't you do it? Why can't you train your officers how to deal with people without killing them? And it's because guns are so handy. Once you have a gun, you want to use it. And police officers, in fact, are trained to use guns more readily than they should be trained to use guns. They should be discouraged from using guns. In fact, like in England, where police officers for the longest time did not carry guns, and they have one of the lowest police officer killing rates in the world. One of the cases that I dealt with as a judge involved a police officer who helped the arrest of a young Indigenous man who was high on drugs near a school, carrying a knife, walking down the sidewalk yelling at everybody, and obviously was presenting a danger if anybody came near him. Police were called. 4 cruisers showed up to deal with this guy. And 3 of the police officers driving those cruisers all drew their guns, and they all immediately told him to drop the knife or they were going to shoot him. The 4th officer, who was in his cruiser, instead of doing that, he took his cruiser and he drove it up against a man and pressed him against a fence so that he was pinned against the fence and he couldn't get away. He couldn't fight. He was, in effect, rendered incapable of harming anybody because he was pinned right up against the fence. And the officer then said to him, "You're not going anywhere. You can't hurt anybody. So why don't you just drop the knife?" Which he did. And he talked to him and got him settled down and then put him in the back of the cruiser. and took him down and charged him. And so I had this young man in court. He was pleading guilty to possession of a weapon. And I said to him, you know, you're very lucky that this officer happened to be there, because by doing what he did, he saved your life. You were going to get shot by those other guys, and you didn't get shot. And you should thank him for saving your life. And the young man, to his credit, turned around. The officer was in the courtroom. He turned around and he said to him directly, I really want to thank you for doing what you did. You did save my life. And the officer then spoke to him in the courtroom and said, I always want to go through my whole policing career without ever seeing or being part of the killing of any person. And more officers like that we need. So I commended the officer for what he did. And then afterwards, the Crown Attorney told me that the officer had in fact been disciplined, and that he had a mark on his record because he had not allowed the other officers to shoot that fellow. And I wrote a letter to the chief of police and I said, this is unacceptable. Why would your superiors be disciplining officers for doing what is clearly the best thing, which is to save lives? And the response they got back was that his record had been expunged and he no longer had a mark on his record. But, you know, the reality is that police officers are predominantly from non-Indigenous and non-Black communities. And they have been educated in the public schools of this country to believe in the myth of white superiority, to believe in the myth of white supremacy. There's a study that's being published relatively soon on how our public schools have taught white supremacy for generations and generations. And that's true for Canada as well. And it is that if you are not seen as being part of that community, that you are literally disposable and therefore not entitled to the same kind of respect that others receive. I posted a Facebook comment a number of months ago now, I guess, about the incident involving the fellow who entered the Prime Minister's residence armed with several guns, and he barricaded himself in a building and threatened to kill people. And the police officers talked to him for a long time and got him to give up his weapons and to surrender, instead of shooting him, which they could have done because they could see him. They had the ability with a sniper to shoot him, but they didn't. They chose not to. And my response in the Facebook comment was, that's not the kind of way, that's not the way that they deal with people of color. If that had been a man of color who was behind the barricade with a gun threatening to kill somebody, the sniper would have shot him. And that's because of the way that the police are trained, and that's because of the systemic bias, which we are now referring to as systemic racism, plays out in our practices and in the way that we do things. So that's a long answer to a relatively short, but it's a complicated question. And it also begins with the fact that most people have never engaged in a dialogue about what systemic racism is, how it manifests itself, and what it includes. And I've always said at a very simple level, racism is about intention. So racism, when you accuse somebody of being a racist, you're basically saying that you are behaving because you believe that somebody is different than you. So it's about your intention. You intend to mistreat them. Systemic racism is when we don't intentionally treat somebody in a bad way, but we end up with the same result because the system almost compels us to do things in a particular way. So systemic racism, systemic bias is because we are working in a system that is systemically biased. And all of you who are caught up in the social work system know what I'm talking about, because you're always being told about rules. You're always being directed by people who do not have an understanding of what it is that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And they are telling you to do things which you know are not going to work or not going to be good in the long run, and that there are better solutions if we just did things a little differently.
Thank you, Senator. And I know if we don't get to all the questions, no worries. Is it okay if we are able to forward questions to you via email for later answers if we have to?
Absolutely. In fact, I insist on it because the time is short, and of course you have other things that you want to take care of. But I think everybody who has given us a thoughtful question deserves an answer, and I'll be glad to do that.
I do have one more. I have another question, though, if you don't mind, or two more questions. Yeah. I'm joined by Executive Director Murray Sinclair.
Hello, Mary.
Good afternoon. How are you, Senator?
I'm good.
Okay. First of all, I just really need to thank you for ensuring that the first calls of action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were all around Child and Family Services, so thank you for that. Definitely, we use that as a roadmap in making fundamental change in child and family, so Masai. I do have a question, but a sort of a little bit of background. So, as an executive director of a delegated agency for the last 16 years in British Columbia, and I'm also part of the National Advisory Committee on Child Welfare Reform, as mandated by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Definitely, I know since we received prevention dollars within the agencies at actual costs, that we're now able to finally, especially in British Columbia for the first time, provide prevention dollars to the community. So finally, we're able to build that capacity in community so parents can take care of their children and nations can take care of their families. And I think that's really important to understand the fight that we had to ensure that we actually had federal enabling legislation. So I have the first question is to really, if you could please expand on what exactly enabling legislation means in relation to true sovereignty. And I think there are some gray areas or there's some confusion with that. The second piece of work, so we actually developed a traditional model of child and family well-being. We have a model of jurisdiction that shows the responsibilities of chief and council, other leadership, but also is built on our potlatch system, our traditional governance. So there's a role for hereditary chiefs, a role for parents, grandparents, and whatnot. So in your article, you had talked about this whole new legislation is like a new car, and that you have to kind of learn how to drive it. So we're at the place where we do have a model based on years and years of research. Carrier Sekani Family Services vision is that one day will be self-determining in health, social, and legal services. And so now that we have the funding to, of course, cover like data management, which is one of your first calls to action was that where are the children, but we've expanded, like not only where are the children, we need the numbers, but we know how well they're doing. So we're engaging in that work to develop the performance framework for outcomes for children. So we're doing that so that we could make good decisions. So we also have community wellness teams in community so that they can make decisions based on what's best for their children. And we also have the legislation that we're drafting is a rights-based legislation, not only on Indigenous rights, incorporating the calls to action, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, but it's also the rights of a Carrier Sekani child. For example, the child has a right to their territory, to their culture, but they also have a right to benefit from the resources of their territory. So it's a different way that we're looking at developing our legislation coming from years of research and listening to community. So I would just like, the second question is I would like to ask like, what are the key advice, the most important things to consider in moving to assume jurisdiction for our chiefs and our leaders? What's the key advice that you would have? Thank you.
All right. Well, the two questions are sort of related, so let me see if I can deal with them in less time than your question took, Mary. So, and I probably will fail at that because I'm so long-winded. So you asked about, for me to talk a bit about enabling legislation versus the concept of sovereignty and kind of what that conversation entails and how they stand together. And then moving to assuming jurisdiction and what's the important advice there. So let me begin with that second question by saying that, there are problems with relying upon federal legislation to go about doing your work because, the dialogue from the Indigenous viewpoint has always been about this. We've always had the right to do this, and we should continue to do it our way. So we need the feds to get out of the way and allow us to do our own thing. And so the federal government just doesn't know how to get out of the way. And that's the problem. They keep insisting that their legislation needs to be, that they need to have some kind of legislative mechanism in place. And so I don't know that I foresee a day within my lifetime or within the foreseeable future in which the feds don't insist on having some kind of legislative mechanism in place. So it's the same thing as the Indian Act, for example. The feds say that when you say, let's do away with the Indian Act, they'll always agree with you. I say, yeah, of course, let's do away with the Indian Act, but what are we going to replace it with? And if you say to them, well, nothing, they'll say, well, no, we have to have something. And so then you get into this whole dialogue about, do we really need your legislation to govern our lives? Of course not, but they insist on it. So let me just say that the key to assuming jurisdiction is just do it. That's the key. Just do it. Whatever it is that you need to do in order to do it, just do it. And let others challenge you. Let others try to stop you, but just do it. We have been cowed into believing that we can't do it until we get permission first. When the reality is that if we sit around waiting for permission to do things, then we're going to be sitting around a long time. And let's stop sitting around waiting for somebody else to give us permission. Let's just do it. We would never have hesitated if the Europeans had not come here. We would never have hesitated to do this. And so we shouldn't hesitate now. Let's just do it. So let me just deal quickly with the issue of enabling legislation versus sovereignty. It goes back again to that principle that I talked about, that the feds believe that you can't do it, you can't exercise your sovereignty until we recognize your right to exercise your sovereignty, until we tell you how to exercise your sovereignty. So in order for you to exercise your sovereignty, you need some federal law that describes how you're going to exercise that sovereignty and how you're going to engage with us and with others. So enabling legislation to the federal government and generally to the legal community is that you have to find a law that says you can do this before you can do this. So it's like it's not legal until the law says it's legal. Whereas in reality, it's the reverse, that you can do anything you want unless there's a law that says you can't do that. That's the way that human behavior is. And so that's the view that I take, that you can do anything you want unless there's a law that says you can't do what you want. So enabling legislation is actually misnomered because it's not enabling legislation so much as it is disabling legislation. When you look at Bill C-92, it actually takes away a lot of your jurisdiction. It forces you to recognize provincial jurisdiction. It forces you to work out agreements with the federal government. It forces you to work out agreements with provincial governments. And whether or not you chose to do that or chose to go in other ways, of course, still up in the air. But in the exercise of sovereignty, you don't need that kind of legislation. You just do it. And so that's sovereignty. Just so to put it in its simplest form, sovereignty is like human life. Each individual is able to do everything within their power that they need to do in order to stay alive. That's the same idea exists for a nation of people. A nation of people is sovereignty because it has the right to do whatever it needs to do in order to stay alive. And so when you think about sovereignty, just think about a human life. So, and let me also just point out that, my presentations to teachers, I always talk about the fact that, we have a responsibility in raising our children and educating our children to help them answer 4 questions. And those questions are, where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? And everything that you do as a child welfare agency should also be part of the answers to those questions. Where did you come from? So what is your history as child welfare? Not an agency per se, but what is the history of child welfare among your people? How did you make those decisions before? Where are you going? So what's the purpose of child welfare? What is it that you want to achieve down the road with child welfare? What are the ambitions of your child welfare processes? Why are you here? So why do we need a child welfare agency? And who are you? So what does this agency look like in the overall scheme of the sovereign nation? So I think you can always reflect upon what it is that you're doing by looking at those 4 questions, no matter what it is. So, all right.
Thank you, Senator. I'm hoping you could answer one more question. And for those that have other questions, we actually will guide them to our communications inbox, and I'll get those questions to you after as well. We have one more question from Chief Karina Lewin. If you don't mind, she's going to take the mic ask her question.
Chief, go ahead.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for your very informative and emotional presentation today. I have a question in regards to a comment you made regarding the high apprehension rate of children at birth in Manitoba. And it happens in our province as well. So I was just wondering, do you find Aboriginal agencies are being supported in addressing the issues and supporting families? And or is it mainly the provincial child welfare system that deals with such a unjust apprehension of children at birth with no just cause? Mercy.
Yeah, thank you. One of the reasons why, and this isn't the sole reason, but one of the reasons why there's such a high apprehension rate at birth is that it is known that the mother has problems. It is known that the mother needs help. It is known that the family itself is spread out and may not be able to provide care in a place where the mother has easy access to. So there are other social problems that are at play. And one of the reasons why agencies apprehend in Manitoba is because both the federal and provincial governments signed agreements, sometimes with the insistence of Indigenous agencies, to move away from block funding, so that Indigenous agencies now only get funded or get primarily funded if they apprehend and take a child into care, whereas before they would get a block fund, and therefore they could provide services to the mother without taking the child into care. They could provide services to the family without taking the child into care. And now their options of doing that are more limited because while they still get some block funding, some limited amount of money to do that preventative work, it's much less than they would get by taking the child away. And even when they take the child away, they don't get funded for placing the child with extended family. They get funded more if they place the child with foster family, with a stranger family, which is really illogical. But so all of that needs to be addressed. And so the question is whether the agencies are being supported in declining to apprehend or take kids into care at birth. And the reality is that they're not being supported financially. And so their ability to provide support to the family at the outset is dependent upon their taking the child into care. Sometimes they do it through voluntary placement agreements and consent orders of apprehension, but there's almost always a care model that they have to exercise in order to be able to do anything to help the family. I always tell people, it's kind of like if we paid the police for each person they arrested, just think of how many arrests they would make in a given year just to get funded. They'd be arresting everybody. Whether you needed to be arrested or not, they would just arrest you and say, all right, sorry, we arrested you, we held you for a few hours, we're going to let you go. But in the meantime, they get money paid to them for having done that arrest. That's illogical. We don't fund police on that basis. We shouldn't fund child welfare agencies on that basis either.
Well, it sounds as though we have a response, Senator. One moment.
Thanks, Senator Sinclair. I definitely noticed when I did go through Canada that the way that the different provinces were funded actually had impacts on their rates of children in care. With the win of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal in 2016, we are now where prevention is paid at actuals. In the past, the model of funding you're talking about, that was the model. The feds would pay however much money it took to keep a child in care, but there was no money there to prevent that child going into care. The tables have turned, and definitely that is no longer the case. In British Columbia, we never received prevention dollars just until the last couple of years. So we're able now to actually have the funding. So if a young mother needs supports to keep her child in care, we just pay for it at actual costs. The rest of the country are under a different type of funding agreement. In BC, we have a business model. So if I ask for X amount of dollars, and if it goes above and beyond that, I just bill for that. So there's cultural programming, supports, home renovations, milk, diapers, anything the family and the child needs to keep their child. That's what we were able to pay for, and we never had that. So it's definitely a lot different, and I've seen that across the country where there are disparities. I think the model that we have in BC, where we have a business proposal to say this is X amount of dollars that we think we're going to need, and if we need more, then we just go to ISC and say this is how much more dollars we need to ensure our families and the parents are able to keep their child at home.
You don't have a right-wing conservative government, that's probably why, so thank you.
Well, Senator, we love to have you all day, but of course, you're a busy guy as well. For those that would like to send their, or are you?
Those are words I do not hear from my wife at home. Okay, she keeps telling me get out of the house. Okay, thank you.
Well, we'll definitely for those people that have questions or more questions, I'll send them your way. All you have to do is just for our live stream audience, email us communications@csfs.org. Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.
We'll see.